The Kyoto Protocol and Democracy and Diplomacy by Alexis, Miskelly, and Matthew Stringer.
The Kyoto Protocol was a treaty that brought together many different countries to agree to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. However, many who originally signed the document did not stay true to their promise. In this documentary, we will dissect how democracy and diplomacy affected the Kyoto Protocol's formation and how the protocol was enacted.
Government leaders who broke their promise in the Kyoto Protocol highlight the weak points of democracy and diplomacy when it comes to environmental issues.
To summarize the Kyoto Protocol, it took the framework from the United Nations Convention on Climate Change, which officially recognized the problem of climate change and created a pathway to achieve the goal of slowing climate change. The Kyoto Protocol was made to put this plan in motion by holding countries accountable for their greenhouse gas emissions and other actions destructive to the environment, like deforestation. For instance, the Kyoto Protocol Reference Manual from the United Nations, Article 3, Paragraph 3, covers direct human-induced afforestation, reforestation, and deforestation activities. Accounting of these is mandatory. Each Annex 1 party must report on and account for emissions and removals in the commitment period on lands on which these activities have occurred. In order to establish the protocol, political leaders and scientists came together to debate on the issue of climate change and how to fix it. They argued the economic cost of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, as well as the environmental destruction if they don't lower their emissions. Their arguments were civil and mostly science-based. Leaders of countries argued for their standing in the protocol, and as time went on, if leaders were unhappy with the protocol, they would leave, like Canada's withdrawal in 2011. Environmental activists worked to make the protocol a reality and still try to hold countries accountable for their agreement and protests today.
It is important to keep in mind the protocol was adopted in December 1997. This was at a time when whether or not climate change was real was still being debated, and there was much less scientific evidence than there is now. However, despite the lack of equal amount of scientific data that exists today, many people were aware and concerned about the effects of greenhouse gases on our planet, as shown through creation of things like Earth Day and the National Resource Defense Council. A lot of countries are becoming aware that this planet might not always be habitable if we don't change our ways. Japan had an oil crisis in the 70s, making them more aware of their limited resources. There were protests throughout New Zealand over its mining of limite because of its effects in the environment in the early 1990s.
The Kyoto Protocol categorized the participating countries into categories. Annex 1 are countries that are industrialized and either could be countries in economic transition or were members of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or the OECD.
The OECD is an international organization with 25 member countries in 1992 that work around the world.
Next, we have Annex 2 countries, which are the same countries as Annex 1, except countries still in economic transition are not included. Annex 2 countries are required under the Kyoto Protocol to provide economic and technical assistance to countries still in development, so they can become more environmentally friendly countries. Finally, we have non-Annex 1 countries, which are made up of still developing countries, some of which have been recognized to be more at risk to the effects of climate change, whether that's prone to unpredictable weather events, low coastlines, susceptible to flooding, droughts, or desertification.
This was an excellent use of diplomacy because different countries had different roles depending on where they were in their development and their economic resources, creating a way where economically advanced countries could help poor countries. However, many of these countries who receive these resources are big contributors to pollution because of their large population size. For example, both Bangladesh and China are non-Annex 1 countries with high population density. Even though some non-Annex 1 countries were big contributors to greenhouse gases, this system was still necessary as it helped the rest of the non-Annex 1 countries.
But unfortunately, this system was exploited.
An example of this is Article 3.7 of the Kyoto Protocol. Article 3.7, otherwise known as the Australia Clause, stated that in 1990, any land use change, like land clearing or urban expansion, that emits greenhouse gases will be included in the calculations of the 1990 baseline. These calculations indicate what percent of greenhouse gases a country needs to decrease by a certain year. At first, this sounds like a good example of diplomacy at work because it gives Australia the highest greenhouse gas emissions in the world, but in actuality, it was a vast advantage to them. 1990 was an outlier for Australia with the amount of land clearing used, so Australia was easily able to bring their greenhouse gas emissions to the baseline in just a few years. The decrease in greenhouse gas emissions was actually so grand that Australia was able to use tons of greenhouse gases without going over the baseline for things like fossil fuels and electricity.
This oversight was no coincidence, as this article was made almost solely to give Annex I countries like Australia more leeway instead of actually tackling greenhouse gas emissions that could truly help the environment.
Why might someone do this? Well,
countries' economic standing changed throughout the years they were in the protocol, and it can cost a lot to reduce greenhouse gases to the level the Kyoto Protocol wanted. It is cheaper not to put in the extra effort for the environment. This was a common argument against the Kyoto Protocol.
there are many different ideas and opinions surrounding the protocol. On December 10, 1997, William Clinton, president at the time the protocol was created, said to reporters, "I am very pleased that the United States had reached a truly historical agreement with other nations of the world to take unprecedented steps to address the global problem of climate change. The agreement is environmentally strong and economically sound. It reflects a commitment by our generation to act in the interests of future generations."
However, years later, environmentalist and former vice president under Bill Clinton, Albert Gore Jr., said, "The UK is one of the only nations on this earth that has actually met and even exceeded its goals under the Kyoto Protocol." This quote tells us that not all the countries in the protocol kept up with their promise.
He also said,
"Yet we must be realistic. Solving this problem will take time. It has been created over a period of time. We're now, of course, accelerating the process by which climate change is being created. But we have to begin to reverse the trends that created the problem, and in doing so recognize that it will take some time."
As you can see, the protocols in the protocol were not all around popular. George W. Bush called the 7% emissions cut unrealistic. This was a common mindset of political leaders, especially ones who cared more about the economy than the environment.
Not all politicians had this view, however. In May 31st, 2007, today's Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, said, "The President's proposal duplicates activities already underway by the United Nations to build on the Kyoto Protocol and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The U.S.-sponsored meetings he proposes are likely to require considerable time and effort without advancing a new international agreement to address global warming." She was speaking on the Bush administration's plans to establish another agreement on greenhouse gas emissions instead of actually working to lower the United States emissions.
There were many other political leaders similar to George W. Bush who didn't support the Kyoto Protocol, which can be seen in the 2012 United Nations Climate Change Conference. This was a conference where 37 countries voted to push back the Kyoto Protocol's deadline from the end of 2012 to 2020.
Even though 37 countries voting together is a good example of democracy, it was taken advantage of and used to excuse the government's neglect in following through with the protocol.
Democracy and diplomacy must be used to create peaceful change in our modern world. Government leaders must realize that they will have nothing else without our planet. They have to look at the science that tells them that they must make change in a big way if we want to help our world. Many countries involved in the Kyoto Protocol joined because they could see their country changing. Northern countries like Iceland see their glaciers recede or coastal regions losing their homes to the rising water levels. These effects of climate change will become relevant to everyone if our leaders don't work together through democracy and diplomacy and lower our greenhouse gases. The Kyoto Protocol was a great idea. Countries coming together, working through our differences to create change was not the problem, but government leaders caring more about money and power than our planet's well-being, our home's well-being.